One of the main issues of the conference, of the forum, was return of history. How much this is really relevant to speak about that today?
Well, it isn't the United States now that countries are looking to. There are other models, there are other players. It's very much a multipolar world.
Yeah. Mr. Carden, thank you so much for being with us, for your time. And also, I would like to thank you for your input in this very forum, which was held in Georgia, in Tbilisi, which is really very interesting forum and gathering of the very specific and very delicious guests, and very distinguished guests. You gathered here in Tbilisi to share their ideas with local society and local audience, which is quite helpful for us. Thank you for that.
Well, it's my pleasure. It's great to be here in Tbilisi, my first time, and I know that everyone is really enjoying the conference, and I think that it's to the benefit of us as it is to you all, so we can speak frankly to one another in the absence of intermediaries. So I'm very pleased to be here.
Thank you. So what I would like to talk about is one of the main issues of the conference, of the forum, was return of history. How much this is really relevant to speak about that today, and what are the reasons for speak about the returning of the history, returning of the realpolitik, also very important. What the history and realpolitik, how much this is collaborated to each other?
Well, when people talk about the return of history, what they're implicitly critiquing is the idea of the end of history. So the end of history was an idea that was very prevalent and popular in the 1990s. And it posited that because the Cold War was won by the United States, that democratic liberalism, neoliberal economy was going to be the model for all mankind forever. So that was the end of history. It didn't work out that way. We've had 30 years of the neoliberal economic agenda in the United States, in Europe, and beyond. We've had one financial economic crisis after another. We've had one geopolitical crisis after another. And what we're seeing now is a return to realpolitik, as you say, but also a return to nationalism, patriotism. What you've seen in the elections with Brexit in the UK, with Donald Trump in the United States, Georgia Dream here in Georgia, is a rejection of this idea that we should cede our national sovereignty to supranational institutions. So I think that that's what we're exploring. What does this new world look like? How do we navigate it? And it's going to differ, right? The way that the United States and Russia and China navigate it is going to necessarily be different from the way that powers like Russia and Turkey and Iran navigate it, and the way smaller powers like Georgia, like your neighbors, Armenia and Azerbaijan, the way that they navigate it. So right now we're in a period of international geopolitical ferment. What do we do with this new future? And I think that the conference showed that we really are in a new era. And what I mean by that is, look at who came to the opening remarks, right? The United States didn't send anyone, right? Our ambassador didn't show up. Yeah. The Chinese sent someone. So I think that says a lot. Because it isn't the United States now that countries are looking to. There are other models, there are other players. It's very much a multipolar world.
Even more, it was very fascinating that during the first day of the conference, which you mentioned, that the Chinese ambassador visited and addressed to the society, and U.S. ambassador did not. So she resigned the same day.
That's right.
Yes. So what I'd like to ask you, what is the pivot point when we can say that there is the return of the history? the idea of the end of the history has ended, and now we are back in a history.
Why are we there? Why are we back?
Yes, and what is the pivot point? What is the main point when we can declare that this is what it is?
Well, I don't know if history works in quite that way. I think that oftentimes, it's like the old saying, things happen gradually and then all at once, right? And I think that we'll look back on this period probably using the COVID crisis, epidemic, pandemic, whatever, as a point of demarcation. We'll look back at 2020 around there and say that is when probably will mark the end of the end of history period. So from about the end of the Cold War, 1989, 1992, to COVID. And I think that COVID is probably an underappreciated marker because it did actually point up to the real shortcomings that the supranational model in terms of economics. So you had this pandemic, and in the United States, we needed masks, we needed all sorts of things that we realized we no longer produced. We had outsourced it to China because we were told that the neoliberal end of history model, that was a good thing. Well, it turned out not to be a good thing. And so people really began to rethink their assumptions. So I think that the COVID period really accelerated the move from the unipolar idea to where we are now, which is very much, obviously, a multipolar world.
In that regard, since you were the advisor to the U.S. State Department about Russia-U.S. relations.
Very briefly, yeah.
Yes, but anyway, so you know the Russia, you know the Russian politics, you know the U.S.-Russian relations, and etc. So I would like to go back to 2007, very famous Putin's address on Munich. Was it the start of the end of the period of the end of the history, or was it the prediction of that?
Well, it was one of the important markers, right? So let's think about what led up to that speech. Why did he give that speech? Well, he gave the speech because after 9/11, the United States, under the influence of neoconservative ideologues, decided not to address the problem of Al-Qaeda directly, but instead decided to go to war against Iraq. And the United States went to war against Iraq against the advice, against the pleadings of Russia, against the pleadings and urgings of Germany and France. And it turned out to be a disaster. And that was very clear by the time Mr. Putin gave his famous address in Munich. So that was one of the things. That was one of the cracks in the walls, one of the cracks in the great edifice of the unipolar world. And that's a very important speech because what also happened was that it turned many of the people in Washington who had thought that they had a partner in Mr. Putin, similar to the kind of puppet that Boris Yeltsin was.
Yeah.
They realized that he was his own man. He was declaring in that speech that Russia is going to pursue an independent foreign policy, its own course. And people in Washington, particularly the neoconservatives, didn't like that. And Putin became their main enemy beginning around that time. And then, of course, events that followed that, accelerated that. But that is an important marker in that period, yes.
So another very important marker, despite the war in Georgia was also a very important marker, definitely. But the Ukraine, the full case, starting from the 2013 and the full-scale invasion in 2022. So how much this conflict affects the unipolar world?
To a great degree. However, you can see in the reaction of the global South towards the war that people had already been moving away from that, away from the unipolar world. People in the United States and in Western Europe, I think, were shocked that the global South and a lot of the non-aligned countries were not going to go along with the pro-Ukrainian approach that we've taken. So it was very clear by their reaction to what was going on that that ship had sailed, and that people in the global South are very skeptical of our claims with regard to what's happening in Ukraine. In other words, they don't, having lived through various attempts by the United States to boss them around, to overthrow their governments, to do all sorts of things, they don't necessarily trust our narrative, right? They see it for themselves. So the idea that Vladimir Putin woke up one morning in February of 2022 and decided to invade Ukraine and take over Ukraine because he's evil, because he wants to reestablish the Soviet Union, is simply not a credible story. But it was the story that our elites were peddling. And they understood that the conflict long predated, by 8 years, what happened in 2022. They also understand that no one has clean hands in the Ukrainian situation. We were deeply involved in Ukraine after the Cold War. There are elements in Western Ukraine that were set on overthrowing their democratically elected president in 2014. A lot of these things are aware, people are aware of these issues, and don't necessarily buy the story that we and the British and the French and the Germans are selling, and they're right to be skeptical of it.
So that's great point. I mean, and let's talk about the comeback of the Donald Trump as a president of the United States. How much of his return brings back the understanding of the real politics and real issues and the end of the unipolar moment towards the Washington elite, towards the, on one hand to elite, and on the other to the policy-making process in the United States?
I think they misunderstand. I think American elites fundamentally misunderstand the meaning of Donald Trump. I think that they see him as an aberration. I think that they see him as someone who doesn't accurately reflect the will of the people. And they, I think, are mistaken. Mr. Trump's brand of American nationalism, his mercantilist domestic economic policies, his kind of return to a more sensible, retrenched American foreign policy are all things that are incredibly popular in the United States. They're not popular among the elite. They're not popular among, people who are in the insular Washington think tank world. So their expectation or hope that Trump is some sort of aberration is deeply misplaced, and they're going to be sorely disappointed. Of course, none of them thought that he was going to be able to return to the presidency. And of course, many of them, in the intervening period, try to put him in jail and things like that. So I think that they don't understand him, and they don't want to understand him.
This is elite. This is elite. But what about the people? And why this matters? How much the so-called Trumpism is strong in the United States? Why I'm asking that? Because Trump's term, he has already left about 3.5 years. and to understand what is happening next of the Donald Trump. This is really very crucial from my point of view. How much the strongest Trump is, what his comeback is based on, actually. How much strong is that feelings inside the United
Very
States?
strong. And it's based on the failure of the American elites and policymakers to craft an economy that works for all the American people. The financial elites in the United States have done very well. Yeah. If you're rich, you've stayed rich, you get richer. What people forget is that all of these free trade agreements and the decision to bring China into the World Trade Organization hollowed out the American middle and working class. Millions of jobs were lost, shipped to Mexico, shipped to China. Those were the jobs, incidentally, that made the things that we needed during COVID. So that model failed, and it failed the American people, and they're acutely aware of it. They're acutely aware. Trump's voters are acutely aware that they've been left behind over the last 30 years, right? Yeah. They also are acutely aware that the wars planned by the American elites in Washington don't kill the children of the elites who don't volunteer for the armed forces. They killed their children. So if you're in the heartland of America, there's a very good chance that you've lost your job, your livelihood, possibly your child or a cousin or a brother in one of these senseless Middle Eastern wars. So these people are, I think, very justly angry, and they saw in Trump someone who was going to put an end to these policies that have, in large part, destroyed their lives.
But the system is also very strong. Can they defeat the system? I mean, this frustrated society versus the system.
Yeah. Well, it is, and it has its strongest opponent in Trump and in his vice president. The real test is going to be in 3 years. As you rightly point out, Mr. Trump is a lame duck. He's done in 3 years. The question is, can someone like J.D. Vance bridge this divide? Well, he's the perfect person to do that because he's of both worlds. Donald Trump has been an elite his entire life, right? He was born rich, he stayed rich, fine. J.D. Vance comes from the world, the world of the broken working and middle class in the middle of the country, from Ohio. But he's also elite. He worked his way up. Yeah. He went to Yale. But he also served in the Army. No, he was a Marine. It's possible that in Vance we have someone who is going to be able to make the long-term adjustment that is needed in the United States. Only time will tell.
Elon Musk said that Donald Trump should be resign and next president should be, and J.D. Vance should stay there. Is it kind of the, I don't know what is happening inside, now, and maybe no one knows, but can we say that this is kind of the first steps of the next election? I mean, this is the campaign for the election for the J.D. Vance, somehow.
I don't think that J.D. Vance has sanctioned this stuff from Elon Musk. Elon Musk is an out-of-control figure. Trump made a mistake in bringing him in. He doubled that mistake by giving him so much power to just ransack the federal government. Someone like Musk, unfortunately, we have this tech oligarchy in the United States that, because they've done so well, have accrued quite a lot of power. But it's not any kind of power that's held accountable. And if you have, what you need to keep that power in check is a strong government. So Mr. Trump made a terrible mistake bringing someone like that into the government and then allowing him to decimate. I'm not saying that the government doesn't need reform. I'm not saying that it's perfect. I'm not saying that it is in certain places, bloated and inefficient. Governments by their nature are bloated and inefficient. And someone like Elon Musk is now throwing a temper tantrum for probably purely, psycho-emotional reasons that have nothing to do with American politics. So the sooner he vanishes from the scene, I think the better off we will all be.
Thank you so much for this inputs of insight, but inside of U.S. politics. But let me go back to this foreign policy, foreign politics, and international relations. You mentioned that, and we talked about the end of the era of the end of history. This kind of tautology. So and you mentioned about the neoliberalism. So we have right now the quite clear picture that neoliberalism made to grow up China, for instance. I mean, China's economy is based on neoliberal decisions from the Western side to move all their productions, to all their creativity towards the China, etc. And not only China, to Asia for the cheap working force, and it's searching for the cheap working force and the cheap energy resources, and etc. So, and now we see that this is the kind of boomerang for the Western countries. So, what will be this new world order in your point of view when we have this two huge economic powers on one hand, United States, on the other hand, China, which is still not so fastly, but anyways, still growing its economy, and the United States, which has struggled to somehow to bring back the production plus process inside.
Yeah, it's going to be a period of great transition. One of the things I think people have to keep in mind when they're talking about China is that they have tremendous internal structural problems of their own with regard to their economy. Trump is right in trying to bring back the American manufacturing and industrial base. Whether or not using tariffs as a stick to do that is an open question, and I guess we'll see what happens. The United States made a terrible mistake in deciding to trade in its industrial and manufacturing base. A base, let's be very clear that really with that manufacturing power joined together with the fighting force of the Soviet Union combined to win the Second World War. Why we decided to jettison that in favor of a service economy based on things that are intangible and that are worthless when it comes to a war, and worthless as a means of national power is very, very hard to understand. Certainly the American people don't understand it, hence the rejection and hence the rise of Trump.
But still there are a lot of people inside the Western elite which are against to change the approach. They're still remaining to keep the system on the place, not to change it. And how much is it in the interest of the West?
I mean, it depends on what you mean by the West. If we're talking about the Davos elites,
yeah, probably.
They're not interested in changing it because that's their world. They have very little connection to the world that actually makes the things that we use. That's a problem. This divorce, this divide, as you pointed out, between the people who make the decisions and the people who make the things. The question is, how do you bridge that, right? And how do you make a country, an economy, a political system that works just as well for the people who make the things as for the people who own the things?
Yeah, definitely. So the biggest loser in this process, as I believe, is the European Union. I mean, if we talk about the multipolar world, we can name that there is one pole from the United States, one pole from China. Frequently said Russia is the independent pole as well in this multipolarity. But usually no one names European Union as an independent pole. Why that happens?
You know, when I get questions about the European Union, I always go back to what a professor told me when I studied in Moscow. I studied at IMGIMO, and we were taking a course on the European Union, and the professor was a Russian scholar, and she said, "We don't take this at all seriously. We don't even know what it's supposed to be in Russia." Yeah. And I think it was kind of like,
what year?
This happened in 2011.
2011, okay.
And I thought, well, that's honest, and she has a point. And it's a talking shop. It's not. The Russian view of the European Union is essentially correct. The problem, though, with the European Union is that because it has a foreign policy and defense dimension, elevates certain voices to more prominence than they ordinarily would be. Yeah. So you have people like the current European Union Foreign Minister or Commissioner, Kaja Kallas, yeah, who's an Estonian, who has a very deep-seated and long-seething hatred of Russia. Well, that's okay. People have those feelings for understandable reasons depending on where they're from, right? The problem is when you turn those feelings into policy, yeah, right? So someone like that normally wouldn't have a seat at the table and wouldn't have such a big hand in policy making. But the European Union seems to have a habit of elevating these very hawkish, anti-Russian voices to prominence. But the European Union ultimately is a relic of another time. It still exists. It's still functioning in much the same way that a zombie does in a horror movie. It's dead, but it's still moving.
Yeah. So another important issue regarding the Europe at all and its security is the NATO. And the conflict we are facing in Ukraine is one of the main reasons is the NATO enlargement. At least this is recognized. It is declared by the Russian side, and it is recognized by the U.S. president and his allies inside the United States White House and etc. So, what does it mean for the Europe and its security architecture when we have this kind of big conflict, big clash between Russia and the so-called West, with its NATO, with United States involved, at least during the Biden period, and even now some supports are coming from the United States of the Trump period. But Trump is more focused on the different issues. He even declared that he's tired to be focused on the Ukraine so much, and he's searching. He's kind of he can't stand on this issue anymore, and he was searching for the another issues, and even his last talk with Putin was about that Iran
yeah,
is very
sure,
important, etc.
Well, Trump is right, as he so often is on foreign affairs, to note that Ukraine has taken an outsized importance in Washington. The matter of who governs the Donbass is of absolutely no importance to the United States in reality, right? So you have this, one of the things that connects NATO enlargement is with Ukraine is the Biden administration refused to tell the truth. And the truth of the matter is that there wouldn't have been a Ukraine war in the absence of threats to expand NATO. And that is a core issue at the heart of the Ukraine crisis. Trump understands very well that Russia, for whatever its problems, and Putin's for all of his sins, is a much needed partner for the United States if we are to pursue, for instance, a reasonable policy with Iran. So you don't always get the partners and leaders that you want. You get the ones that you're dealt with. And so this steadfast refusal by the Biden administration to refuse to even engage or speak with Putin for 3.5 years is simply self-defeating. You don't have to like Putin, admire Putin, whatever. The fact of the matter is that Russia is an enormous power. It's one of the only other nuclear superpower is Russia. So you have to engage with them. You have to deal with them. You may not like it, but you have to do it. And that's one of the things that Donald Trump understands.
As you rightly said, that this is no matter who is ruling the Donbass and maybe even full Ukraine at all, not only Donbass. And this is obvious observing how NATO acts, how the United States acts. If that were their crucial interest, I believe they would be involved in this conflict much widely and even sending their force and et cetera, but this is not their interest to be involved in this conflict, to control this territory and et cetera. So as it is for Russia, for instance, they are fighting for that, to control this territory. So in that regard, why so long policy was existed to integrate Ukraine and Georgia, to come to the Russia's borders so much closer to them?
I guess you're asking what could possibly be the reason why we would expand a military alliance right up to the borders of Russia when, after the Cold War, Russia disbanded its own military alliance that was called the Warsaw Pact. Yeah. And in its place, NATO just filled in the void. There are a lot of theories about that. And I think it basically has to do with an American elite perception that Russia is something that we cannot cooperate with, and it's a country that needs to be contained because it's inherently expansionist, it's inherently imperialist. Playing into that, in the United States, you have to understand, are large numbers of emigres from Eastern Europe. So there's a very, very large Polish population in Chicago and in the Midwest, and they vote, and they are, by nature of the history between the two countries, not inclined to see cooperation with Russia as a good thing. So it has a lot to do with domestic political agendas. Now, someone who is a real expert on this is someone who you've met, and it's Ambassador Jack Matlock. And Jack Matlock tells the story of, in the 1990s, he was asked to testify before Congress about NATO expansion. And he said, this is a bad idea. We shouldn't do it. It's going to backfire. And he was told that for domestic political purposes, the Clinton administration wanted to pursue it because President Clinton wanted to get reelected and he needed those votes. So there's a real heavy element of domestic American politics at play when we talk about NATO expansion.
And so in that regard, the content the deterrence of Russia is not a huge interest. I mean, is this not as huge to be involved in the war with the nuclear power? I mean, to contend Russia, to deterrence, for the Russian deterrence.
Deterrence, yep.
Yeah, yep. Deterrence. this is not the kind of the idea which makes you to suffer, to struggle with the nuclear power.
Well, right. There are, that would be one of a number of problems with the idea of NATO expansion. The problem with NATO expansion is that the underlying assumption is that we can't work with Russia as a partner, and that they always have to be an adversary. But the problem is that because Russia is really, in some respects, the leading nuclear power, we have to cooperate with them. And they traditionally had been very good partners in fighting proliferation, for example. And we were able to complete a series of nuclear and arms control agreements with them throughout the history of the Cold War. And then under the Bush administration, we began to tear those agreements up. Right now, we are only about 8 months or so away from when the New START treaty expires. Yeah. There's been no move, as far as I know, between the US and Russia to begin negotiating and talking about extending that treaty. Well, that's an enormous problem. So, again, this, you don't have to like Russia, you don't have to, whatever. The fact is that they're there, they have an enormous amount of power and position in the world, and it's counterproductive to the national security interests of our country if we refuse to cooperate. Not cooperate, if we refuse to engage in diplomacy and dialogue with them. Yeah. That doesn't help them, doesn't help us, and it certainly doesn't help the countries stuck in between.
Yes, and let's talk a little bit about the country which is stuck in between, Georgia, which is kind of has an aspirations to be integrated in Euro-Atlantic three-tier organization and European Union and etc., and especially about NATO when we speak about the integration of NATO and enlargement of NATO. On one hand, it's really interesting how much the NATO enlargement is, it's stopped or even paused for a while because of the conflict, because of the Trump's attempts to negotiate with Putin, etc. But on the other hand, how much is it still possible to be safe being stuck in between with the great powers and to be antagonist for one, two of these two or three? I don't know.
Well, I think that the choice, the idea that Georgia has to choose one or another is what we call a false choice. Aligning yourself with the one puts a target on your back for the other. There are other ways of approaching these things, particularly now in a multipolar world. So smaller countries, smaller powers, actually have more options in a multipolar world than they did in the unipolar world or in a bipolar world. And one of those options available is that of neutrality. And so in the Cold War, countries like Austria, Ireland, Switzerland, Finland, all pursued policies of neutrality. And I think that worked out rather well for those countries. You go to Austria today, you go to Ireland, you go to Switzerland, they have robust economies, they have high standards of living. They don't, they don't have to waste a lot of their resources on a big, defense budget. So small powers would be wise to look at those examples.
But on the other hand, I am interested in the multipolarity. Multipolarity in this particular reason that the great powers, the multipolarity and the New World Order could be kind of the agreement between great powers. And one of the issues they can come to agreement is about the influence first. What part of the world belongs to which great power somehow.
Yeah.
So does it really mean that the small countries has a choice when the big powers decide where their limits end?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, look, spheres of influence is a concept that American policymakers, diplomats, elites claim that we don't believe in. Yeah. That's very hard to believe. Every country, every large power, of course, has a sphere of influence. That doesn't mean that you have to sign on to, you don't have to make military alliances with the great power, right? But, there should be, friendly relations in the manner of, the Finland policy during the Cold War. They were allowed to pursue their own path within limits, which meant basically that they were not going to become part of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Same with Austria. So, it doesn't mean becoming the, auxiliary towards, of the great power, of the great neighboring power, right? There are options, they are limited, but it would be a mistake, for instance, for a country like Georgia or Armenia to decide that they're going to throw their lot in with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization for a number of reasons. The first being that it would upset the hegemonic power to the north, Russia. The other problem is that the United States is rather far off. We've proven ourselves to be not particularly adept at power projection. Signing on to an alliance that was originally meant to encompass countries within the North Atlantic seems to make little sense for countries that are based on the Black Sea.
And let's somehow to sum up this part of our talk. So don't you think that the history is coming back, but the history could be quite different than it was before, when we had the world with the big great powers and closed borders, and one empire could not attempt to another one, and etc. This was a closed borders. And the new world is quite seriously intertwined to each other. So this is not kind of that. If, for instance, the Caucasus is the sphere of influence of Russia, it doesn't mean that Russia can prevent the Chinese interference in the Caucasus or U.S. interference in the Caucasus, and etc. So this is kind of the different multipolarity than we had in the history back in the old times.
Well, the trick is also to balance, right? So look at what is going on in Hungary, for example. Yeah. The Hungarians are reliant on, they're part of the American security umbrella under NATO. They have a reliance on Russian energy and Chinese export markets, right? So they're attempting to balance between the three great powers. Now they get a lot of pushback and a lot of criticism from Washington for trying to do that, but having just been to Hungary, it seems to be working out rather well for them. So, and until recently, until the onset of the Ukraine war, Germany did much the same thing. Germany built its economy on imports of cheap Russian energy, the giant Chinese export market, and the American security umbrella. And it wasn't a problem. It wasn't a problem for them. Well, it wasn't a problem for them until we blew up the Nord Stream pipeline. Yeah. But you see what I'm saying. So multipolarity, I think, is a good thing for middle and smaller powers because it gives you some options to sort of balance between the three.
James Carden, sir, thank you so much for your time, for being with us, for coming to Tbilisi, Georgia for this forum, and wish you good luck.
Thank you very much.